If you read the news on a somewhat regular basis, it is very likely that you've encountered the term gender wage gap. But what does it actually mean? What are the reasons for this phenomenon and what are the drivers behind it? In this presentation, I will shortly introduce the gender wage gap. I will outline how the decision to have a first child impacts the gender wage gap. I will provide evidence for this impact, and finally I will address why the gender wage gap matters and what we can do about it. So what actually is the gender wage gap? Well, it is defined as the difference in average hourly wages between men and women. Currently, in the United Kingdom, it's sitting at approximately 20% in favor of men. It's been decreasing for some while. It was 28% in 1993. 20% gap in favor of men means that for every pound a man earns, a woman will on average earn 80p. The on average is very important here. Throughout this presentation, I will mostly be talking about averages. The gender wage gap does not mean that if you're a woman, you will automatically be earning 20% less, or overall, you will automatically be earning less than your partner or your male colleague. There are reasons behind the wage gap, and most of the gap can be explained by different choices we make in life. One of the biggest choices we have to make in life is whether and when to have a child. So what effect does the decision to have a first child have on the gender wage gap? As we can see from the graph, prior to having the first child, the gender wage gap is stable at around 10%. So for every pound the man earns, the woman will on average earn 90p. However, once the first child is born, the gap will start increasing, and by the time this first child is 20 years old, the gap would have increased to 30%, or for every pound of a man, the woman will on average earn 70p. Again, these figures are on average, so they do not automatically hold for every individual situation. They are taken from a large population of people. Furthermore, the increase in the gap does not necessarily mean that women's wages decrease over this time. In fact, they most likely increase by the time this child is 20 years old. They just didn't increase as fast as the average wages of men during this time. So why does this happen? Well, one of the biggest reasons for why the gender wage gap increases so much after the first child is born into the family is work experience. After the first child is born, women first have to take some time off work because of medical reasons, and afterwards they have been shown to be more likely to seek part-time and flexible work because their time is obviously occupied by childcare and they want to spend time with their children. Altogether, however, this means that by the time this first child is 20 years old, women would have spent on average 3 years less in paid work, which means work overall, and 10 years worth of time less in full-time work, which is defined as work where you spend 25 hours a week at least, or more. And obviously, this means that they would have accumulated significantly less work experience than men who started their careers at the same time and didn't have to pause because of maternity leave and didn't seek flexible work arrangements afterwards, but simply continued building their career through full-time work over the same period of time. So the women, by the time the first child is 20, they would have accumulated much less work experience. This lack of experience has a huge negative effect on the wage progression of women. According to data from the Institute of Fiscal Studies that I have plotted on the graph on the slide, a woman with a graduate diploma that has been working for full-time for a couple of years can expect her salary to increase by approximately 6% every additional year that she spends in full-time work. So if we assume that this woman was earning £100 an hour prior to the birth of her first child, she can expect to, and she remained in full-time employment immediately after her child was born, she can expect to earn £106 the next year, £113 the year after that, and well, by the time this child is 20 years old, she can expect to be earning over £300 an hour, or 3 times as much as she started with when her child was born. However, if the same woman decided to switch to part-time work after a child was born to have more time for childcare, for example, by the time this child is 20 years old, so over the same time period, she would be earning just above the £100 she was earning all those years earlier. Switching to part-time work makes your wage progression virtually disappear. It's very negligible. An extra year of part-time work will have very little impact on your wage. And as we've seen in the previous slide, women tend to accumulate up to 10 years less of full-time work's worth over the 20 years of life of their first child. Connecting that with this graph, we can clearly see that men who have started their career at the same time as women who decide to have a first child will be earning significantly more by the time this child is 20 than the women who decide to switch to part-time work. Another big driver behind the increase in the gender wage gap post the birth of the first child is women shortening their average commute times. After the first child is born, women on average tend to reduce the time they are willing to commute to work for, as they want to be closer to the children. They need to take them to school, pick them up, take them to sports, etc. As we can see from the graph, women's average commute time decreases by 6 minutes during the first 20 years of life of this child, whilst, and this is probably more important, men's average commute times stay exactly the same. Therefore, another gap opens up. It's called the average or the gender commuting gap. It basically just shows that men will on average be commuting to work longer than women during the first 20 years of life of the child. And this gap, which is shown in green on the graph and which has its scale on the right side of the graph, strongly correlates and strongly mimics the gender wage gap that opens up during the first 20 years of life of the first child. So how does this commuting gap and the reduction of women's average commutes impact the women's wages? Well, if women shorten their average commute time or the time they're willing to commute for, they are suddenly choosing their job from a much, much narrower selection of work opportunities. They don't have as many employers to choose from because there are not as many employers in their smaller area. It makes it increasingly likely that they will not be able to find an employer that will truly appreciate their skills and that they will match their skills, and it's probably harder to find a high-paying employer. On top of it all, because they are limited by this area and the employers may know it, the employers might exploit this knowledge and offer women lower wages because they know that the women need to be close to their children and therefore will take a lower paying job that is very near. All this together means that the average wages of mothers are being driven down, whilst fathers or men who do not change their commute times still have the broad selection of work opportunities and their wages remain unchanged. So why should we care about the gender wage gap and what can we do about it? Well, the gender wage gap is not only an issue of gender equality, it does not affect only women. As employment rates reach record high around the world, more often than not, low wages are the cause of poverty, not unemployment. Actually, in the United Kingdom, 2 out of 3 children who live in poverty have a parent in full-time work. That means that for these children, low wages are the cause of poverty, not unemployment. And the same mechanisms that drive the increase in the wage gap from 10% to 30%, these same mechanisms apply to all single parents, men as well. Imagine if you're a single parent, you most likely want to balance taking care of your child and working. If you decide to prioritize taking care of your child, you will want to engage in part-time working and you will probably want to work closer to home. But that will mean, as we've shown previously, that your wages will most likely be lower and they will be progressing slower. And if you decide to prioritize your work and your wage, you will not have as much time to take care of your child. So what can we do about it? Well, we can either try to target the increase in the gap from 10% to 30% and devise policies that will allow parents to maintain their wage progression while still taking care of their children, for example, in-work nurseries. Or we can decide to target the other half of the gender wage gap, which is the initial 10% gap that is there before the first child is born. This gap is there because women tend to study different subjects and tend to choose work that is not as highly paid. Or it is there because of outright discrimination. All of these factors contribute to the 10% initial gap. And that is a target that we can focus on as well.